Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're kicking things off today with a figure that really makes you stop and think. Global military spending in 2024 hit, get this, $2.718 trillion. An all-time high.
Wow.
Yeah, and that's after 10 straight years of increases. It's more than just a number, right? It feels like a real shift in the world.
It absolutely does. It's not just a blip. It signals, really heightened tensions, a different global mood almost. And seeing that kind of sustained rise, well, it points to a big rethink about security, moving away from maybe the post-Cold War peace dividend idea towards rearmament.
Exactly. And that's what we want to dig into today. We're looking at this huge shift happening inside NATO, specifically this really ambitious new defense spending target they've set. We've got some fascinating material here, financial analysis, stuff from the European Parliament, reactions from different countries.
A real mix of perspectives.
Right. So our mission is to unpack what this target actually means, why now, and what the ripple effects are for security, for economics, maybe even for you day to day. We want to cut through the noise.
Definitely. It's a major strategic move, and it's already starting to reshape things, alliance dynamics, budgets, industries. It's a big deal with long-term consequences.
Okay, so let's get into it. This new target unveiled at the NATO Hague Summit in 2025. It's huge. 5% of GDP by 2035.
5%, yeah.
I mean, just think, the old guideline was 2%. And a lot of members, well, they struggle to even hit that consistently. This feels like a completely different league.
It really is a monumental leap. And what's interesting is how they're breaking it down. It's not just one big pot of money for everything.
Right. Tell us about that breakdown.
Okay, so the plan is 3.5% of that 5% is for what they call hard defense. So that's your traditional military stuff, tanks, planes, troops, readiness.
The pointy end of the stick, basically.
Exactly. But then there's this other chunk, 1.5% earmarked for resilience infrastructure. And this is where it gets really broad.
Resilience infrastructure. So that's not just military bases.
No, not at all. We're talking cybersecurity, huge these days, but also things like adapting civilian roads and bridges so they can handle heavy military kit. Think convoys, tanks.
Right, making sure the infrastructure can actually support moving troops and equipment if needed.
Precisely. And upgrading things like ports or airfields, stuff that has a dual use, both civilian and military. It's a recognition that modern defense, well, it goes way beyond the battlefield. It includes protecting critical national infrastructure.
That really broadens the definition of defense spending. And putting it in context, you mentioned the old 2% target. What were the actual numbers like before?
Well, back in 2014, if you looked at the European NATO allies, their average spending was just 1.43% of GDP. Pretty low.
Wow, okay.
By 2024, largely driven by events like, Russia's actions in Ukraine, that average climbed to 2.02%. So progress was being made.
Okay, so momentum was building.
Yes. In 2024, 18 out of the 32 members actually met or beat that 2% target. That was up from only 11 the year before.
So more countries were stepping up.
Definitely. But jumping from that 2% reality to aiming for 3.5% just for hard defense and 5% overall, well, it signals a complete transformation in how the alliance sees its responsibilities. It's a massive statement of intent.
So what's behind such a huge leap? I mean, where's the push coming from? Our sources seem to point pretty strongly towards the U.S.
Yes, there's significant pressure, notably from President Trump during his second term. He's been very consistent, very vocal about allies needing to take, quote, greater responsibility for their own security.
The freeloading argument, basically.
That's the term he's often used, yes. Accusing European nations of relying too heavily on the U.S. security umbrella without paying their fair share, as he sees it.
Okay, but here's something interesting. The U.S. itself spends, around 3.2 to 3.4% of its GDP on defense?
That's right.
But President Trump has apparently said the U.S. doesn't need to hit this new 5% target. He argued, we've been supporting NATO so long.
He did, and that raises some pretty fundamental questions about burden sharing, doesn't it? If the main advocate for the target suggests the U.S. is exempt, what does that mean for alliance cohesion? Is it fair? Does it create two tiers within NATO?
It certainly complicates the picture, and it seems to go beyond just rhetoric. We're seeing reports that Trump might be looking at U.S. troop deployments again.
Yes. The idea of potentially pulling a large number of troops, maybe most of the 35,000, out of Germany.
And redeploying them where?
Reportedly to countries that are meeting spending targets, perhaps like Hungary. It paints a very transactional picture, military presence tied directly to spending levels.
It makes alliance commitments feel conditional.
Well, and that leads to the really sensitive point. Article 5, the cornerstone of NATO, the mutual defense clause.
An attack on one is an attack on all.
Exactly. But Trump's past comments have openly questioned whether the U.S. would actually honor that commitment if allies, in his view, don't pay.
That must send chills down spines in European capitals.
Absolutely. Analysts point out that casting doubt on Article 5, even rhetorically, can be incredibly damaging. It potentially emboldens adversaries and weakens the very deterrence NATO is supposed to provide. Certainty is key to deterrence.
Okay, so while there's U.S. pressure, Europe itself seems to be having its own moment of realization. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is often described as a wake-up call.
A huge wake-up call. There's no doubt it fundamentally shifted the security calculus in Europe. It made the threats feel much more immediate, much more real.
And we saw that reflected in the spending numbers jumping up, with 18 countries hitting the 2% mark last year.
Yes, the urgency became undeniable, and you're seeing some countries really step up to the plate now.
Like who? Who's leading the charge?
Well, Poland is a standout example. They're already spending 4.2% of their GDP on defense, aiming for 4.7% in 2025. That's a huge commitment, the highest in Central and Western Europe.
Wow. 4.7%. They're almost at the 5% target already.
They are. And then you have Germany, historically quite cautious on military spending, but they've significantly boosted it to 1.9% and have this massive $1 trillion special fund. They're even loosening their strict budget rules.
A big shift for Germany. And the UK.
The UK is also increasing spending, aiming for 2.5% by 2027, with talk of maybe 3% long term. So yes, major players are moving significantly.
But presumably not everyone is jumping on the 5% bandwagon with enthusiasm.
No, definitely not. Spain is a key example. Their spending was about 1.24% in 2024. And their prime minister, Pedro Sanchez, has been quite explicit. They will not commit to the 5% target.
Why not? What's the reasoning?
The primary concern cited is the domestic impact. The fear is that reaching 5% would require, really drastic cuts to social programs, healthcare, education, or maybe large tax hikes, things that would be politically very difficult and unpopular.
So it highlights a real tension. How do you get 32 different countries with different economies, different political situations, different priorities to all agree on such a demanding target?
That's the core challenge for the alliance right now, and it leads to the question of funding. Where is all this money going to come from, especially for Europe?
Right. Are there EU-level plans?
Yes, the European Commission has put forward this Rearm Europe initiative. It's got several parts, things like potential EU-backed loans, maybe up to $150 billion. Also activating what's called the National Escape Clause.
Escape clause.
Yeah. It basically allows countries to temporarily exceed EU deficit limits specifically for defense spending. They're also looking at using some regional development funds, the cohesion funds, and trying to get the European Investment Bank involved to mobilize private capital.
So trying to find creative ways to finance it beyond just national budgets.
Exactly. But individual countries are also having to make tough choices. The UK, for instance, plans to cut its overseas development aid budget to free up funds for defense.
That's controversial.
It is. Poland is using a special off-budget fund financed by issuing bonds, so essentially borrowing for defense. Germany, as we mentioned, is relaxing its debt brake rules.
These aren't easy decisions. They all have consequences, potentially hitting social programs, increasing debt.
Absolutely. There are very real economic and social trade-offs involved, potentially affecting inequality or support for public services. It's a difficult balancing act.
Okay, so stepping back, this massive spending increase, it's partly U.S. pressure, partly Europe's own wake-up call. What's the bigger strategic picture here?
Well, NATO officials are clear. They argue these increases are vital to counter the perceived threat from Russia. They point to Russia's own spending, which reportedly jumped 38% in 2024, reaching something like 7.1% of its GDP.
7%, that's significant.
It is. And the war in Ukraine is the starkest example. Ukraine itself, the numbers are almost hard to grasp, spending 34% of its GDP on defense in 2024. And apparently all its non-military spending was covered by foreign aid. That just shows the scale of the need when conflict erupts.
It really puts the numbers in perspective. But beyond Russia, is there another angle, maybe about Europe's own role?
Yes, definitely. There's a growing sense, and you hear this from European leaders too, that Europe needs to shoulder more responsibility for its own security, especially, as the U.S. increasingly turns its strategic attention towards China and the Indo-Pacific.
Building up the European pillar within NATO.
Exactly. Improving Europe's own military capabilities, making sure forces can work together smoothly, interoperability, and boosting the European defense industry. Initiatives like the European Defense Fund or EDIS, the European Defense Industrial Strategy, are aimed at that, encouraging cooperation, reducing reliance on buying everything from the U.S. or elsewhere.
Okay, so more self-reliance for Europe. And what does this mean for, say, investors? Is the defense sector booming?
Well, some analysts are calling this a generational investment theme. You still have the big U.S. players, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, getting strong recommendations because the demand is there.
Right, established giants.
But there's also a view that Europe's awakening, as they call it, offers potentially higher growth. Companies like Airbus or Germany's Rheinmetall are getting a lot of attention, especially firms working on scalable tech or those with diverse businesses and strong government links.
And there's a NATO rule about R&D.
Yes, the 20% equipment rule, which pushes countries to invest in research and development. That tends to benefit companies known for innovation like Northrop Grumman or Sweden's Saab. So yeah, it's definitely shaking up the investment landscape.
Okay, but let's bring it back to the ground level. The economic and societal impacts. We touched on Spain's concerns. Are these widespread?
Very much so. Critics raise serious questions about whether 5% is actually feasible for many countries, given things like inflation, existing high levels of public debt.
Fiscal reality's biting.
Right, and you have public opinion. In places like Spain, Italy, even The Hague saw protests. There's a real debate. Is pouring billions, potentially trillions collectively, into defense the right priority when you have huge challenges like climate change or inequality or strained public services?
It forces a choice about what security really means and what threats are most urgent.
Exactly. There's a fear, a legitimate concern, that this massive defense investment will come at the expense of social welfare, education, health. And that could, increase social tensions, maybe even boost support for populist or far-right parties who capitalize on those grievances.
That's a potential unintended consequence.
It is. The question is, can countries boost defense significantly without undermining social cohesion or neglecting other critical areas? It's a huge political challenge.
But is there an argument on the other side? Any potential benefits beyond just military readiness?
Well, proponents point to that 1.5% for resilience infrastructure. They argue that investment, say, in better roads or cyber defenses benefits everyone, not just the military. It can create jobs, improve civilian infrastructure.
And also use benefit.
Yes. And investing in domestic defense industries, rather than buying everything from abroad, can also provide an economic stimulus, support jobs, foster technological innovation, and reduce dependency. So it's framed by some as an investment that pays dividends beyond just security.
It's definitely a complex calculation with arguments on both sides.
Absolutely. It touches everything: foreign policy, economics, domestic politics, social spending. It's all intertwined.
So to wrap up, NATO's aiming for this really ambitious 5% of GDP defense spending target by 2035. It seems driven by a mix of strong U.S. pressure and a genuine European response to a changed, more dangerous-seeming world, especially after Ukraine.
That seems to be the consensus, yes.
But it's not just about buying more military kit. It involves broadening the idea of security to include resilience, infrastructure, and it forces really difficult choices about national priorities, funding, and potential trade-offs with social spending. It's a fundamental rethink.
It really is. And as the alliance moves down this path, it pushes us all, I think, to ask some tough questions. Will this massive increase in spending genuinely make the world safer? Or could it just make it more expensive, maybe diverting resources from other pressing global or national challenges?
And maybe even, what does security truly encompass today? When threats range from military aggression to cyber attacks, climate change, and social instability. Where should the focus be?
Exactly. It's a deep question with no easy answers, and something definitely worth keeping an eye on as this massive rearmament effort unfolds. Food for thought.